Welcome to St. Jerome's University, and welcome to the St. Jerome Center for Catholic Experience. My name is Megan Shore, and I'm the director of the center. The theme for this year's lecture series is Our Best Kept Secret, Catholic Social Teachings. And it borrows from a 1984 book by James Hugg and Edward DeBerry of the Center of Concern in Washington, D.C. They introduced their book by explaining that the social teachings are frequently described as the best kept secret in the Roman Catholic Church. Tonight's lecture and this season's lecture series is an attempt to make sure that Catholic social teachings are a secret no more. Tonight, we have the privilege and honor of welcoming Dr. Gregory Baum to the center. In part, this evening is to celebrate the launch of the second edition of Gregory Baum's book, Religion and Alienation, a Theological Reading of Sociology. As many of you know, Dr. Baum is one of the leading advocates in Canada of social justice. We're also honored to have Kevin Burns, the English commissioning editor for Novalis, here with us tonight. Kevin was an important figure in bringing together the revised edition of Religion and Alienation. I would like to invite Kevin to come forward and say a few words about Novalis.
Well, you know why I get the English tag for my first four words. Thank you, Megan. And a special thank you to St. Jerome's, of course, for hosting this evening. Gregory Baum is a writer, a thinker, and I am delighted to say, a Novalis author. As a publisher, it's always a delight to follow the learning to which a writer dedicates his or her life. To read each subsequent book is to follow a path of their lifelong learning in a way that enhances our own lifelong learning. In 1939, Father Moses Cody said this about lifelong learning. "We have no desire to create a nation of shopkeepers whose only thoughts run to groceries and to dividends," he wrote. "We want our people to look at the sun, to look into the depths of the sea. We want them to explore the hearts of flowers and the hearts of their fellow human beings. We want them to live, to play, and pray with all their being. We want them to be fully human, eager to explore all the avenues of life and to attain perfection in all their faculties. Life for them," he wrote, "shall not be in terms of merchandising, but in terms of all that is good and beautiful, be it economic, political, social, cultural, or spiritual. They are the heirs of all the ages and of all the riches yet concealed. All the findings of science and philosophy are theirs. All the creations of art and literature are for them. If they are wise, they will create the instruments to obtain them. They will usher in a new day by attending to the blessing of the old. They will use what they have to secure what they have not." Well, this is the spirit, I hope, of the book program at Novalis. It is my hope that our publications touch the heart, the mind, the soul of each of our readers. It is my hope that our books assist each reader in the task of becoming more fully human, of integrating justice and wisdom. It is my hope that our books are superbly crafted examples of literary accomplishment, whether they be resources for the parish, tools for seekers and searchers of the spiritual, or groundbreaking works that challenge the nature of academic study, like the work of tonight's speaker, Gregory Baum. It is my hope that our books continue to honor the now 60-plus year tradition of Novalis, a mission to serve people of all ages and all circumstances who wish to foster their spiritual growth. who are in pursuit of answers to questions of ultimate meaning, people who seek meaningful ways to integrate their faith into daily life, and people who, in good faith, are trying to understand the complex cross-currents of beliefs and ideas that surround them, that surround us. And it is in this tradition that Novalis is delighted to be Gregory Baum's publisher. Megan.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Grace, as well, for being here with us tonight from Novalis. Gregory Baum has deep roots in our community here, and we are fortunate that two of our professors at St. Jerome's, Dr. Scott Klein and Dr. David Seljak, wrote the introduction or the foreword to Religion and Alienation, the second edition. Dr. Klein will introduce Dr. Baum. Dr. Klein is an assistant professor in religious studies here at St. Jerome's University, and he is also the director of the Intercordia program, a program inspired by Jean Vanier to provide university students with an opportunity to build relationships with some of the world's marginalized populations around the world, definitely looking at the vision of Catholic social teachings. So I welcome Dr. Scott Klein to introduce Gregory Baum. Thank you.
I don't pretend to speak English as well as Kevin, so you'll have to bear with me. I'm actually from Missouri, so I'll try to bury my drawl. So, but welcome this evening. I must confess at the outset that I find my job tonight somewhat redundant. Many of you know Gregory Baum and his work very well. Whether it was at St. Michael's University College in Toronto in the 1970s, at a public lecture here in the Waterloo region over the years, or just reading his many books and essays over the long course of his life, we've come to know Gregory quite well. Indeed, Catholic social teaching is not a secret to many of us, because Gregory Baum stood up and spoke. And because we listened, our lives have forever changed. That's certainly true in my part. Gregory is not afraid of a challenge. As a young theologian, he was sent to the Second Vatican Council as a peritus, a theological advisor. Working with the Ecumenical Secretariat, he helped produce three important documents: on religious liberty, on ecumenism, and the Church's relation to non-Christian religions, obviously a very important topic for today. From 1962 to 2003, he was the editor of the Ecumenist, a review of theology, culture, and society published by Novalis, by the way. He handed that job over to his former student, David Seljak, who is with us tonight, sitting here in the front row. You know David as the former director of this center, by the way. We'll not hold that against the center. One of the guiding themes in Gregory's work over the years has been the other, the outsider, the stranger. Books such as Compassion and Solidarity, which was the Massey Lecture in 1987, and The Church for Others, Protestant Theology in Communist East Germany from 1996, are just some of the more profound examples of the work in which the topics of the stranger and the other come front and center. Another theme he has been engaging is engaging the stranger in a theological conversation. When he retired from St. Michael's College in the mid-1980s to take up a position at McGill University, he did so largely to speak with Quebecers and to introduce his Anglo audience to Quebecers. His work on Christian-Muslim dialogue stems directly from his willingness to engage the stranger in a conversation and to make the stranger a stranger no more, indeed to make the stranger a friend. One of the most influential and important books he wrote was his 1975 book, which is one of the reasons why we're here tonight, Religion and Alienation. It was indeed a groundbreaking work that brought theology and sociology into dialogue with each other. Gregory believed that both theology and sociology had much to learn from each other. For example, he learned that both theology and sociology contain the idea of social injustice, or in theological terms, social sin. What characterized this book in 1975 remains true today. Gregory has the ability to take complex issues and communicate them in a concise and understandable way. both David and I teach here at the University of Waterloo and St. Jerome's University, and we give this book to our graduate students and to our undergraduates to help them make sense of very complex issues like Hegel and Marx and people who you probably suffered through when you were undergrads. Gregory actually takes them through, he navigates them through this sort of murky water sometimes. Tonight, Gregory will be speaking about Christian and Muslim relations. In many ways, this topic ties together his work in ecumenical dialogue, his interest in the stranger, and social alienation. Please join me in welcoming Gregory Baum, our friend.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Thank you. I'm very grateful for the invitation to come to St. Jerome's College and to be present at the launching of the second edition of Religion and Alienation. I arrived this afternoon from Montreal, and I forgot my language, my tongue in Montreal, so I have a hard time speaking. I have a cold, but I hope that you will be able to understand me. The book Religion and Alienation was the result of studies which I did in New York City at the New School. I was a theologian. I took a number of years off from the university, and I immersed myself in sociological literature. And this was for me a totally new experience, and I learned many things from it. And one of the things I learned from it was to understand that modernity was such an enormously transforming event in European and North American life. And when I say modernity, I mean industrial capitalism and democracy. Those two institutions created modernity. And of course I knew before that the papacy had totally condemned the arrival of modernity. It was quite well known that is immediately after the French Revolution, the Pope condemned the Charter of Human Rights. In the 1830s, when there was again revolutionary climate in Europe, Pope Gregory XVI again condemned modernity. That is, he wanted Catholics to be faithful to the princes, to the feudal order. Democracy was rejected because the Pope said this meant the domination of the majority, and therefore the minority will be oppressed. It was the rejection of the separation of church and state. The church in those days rejected human rights and religious liberty. I knew all this, but I never really understood the reason why. And when I studied sociology, I discovered that the arrival of modernity was a very profound civilizational crisis. That is, all the sociologists who studied this coming of modernity, the creation of a democratic institution and the creating of the factory system, showed that this profoundly changed the lives of people, the self-understanding of people, the culture in which people lived. And whether you go to the French authors like Alexis de Tocqueville, who went to the USA in the 1830s, or you go to Émile Durkheim, French sociologist who wrote at the end of the 19th century, or if you go to the German sociologists like Ferdinand Tönnies around 1880, or Max Weber a little later, they all contrast traditional society and modernity. And they argue that modernity introduced elements that did not exist before. On the one hand, they recognize, of course, that there were certain advantages of modernity. That is, democracy allowed people to participate in policy making. Science, technology, industrialization made life more easy for people who could afford these new developments. But they also recognized that there were profound cultural changes that were taking place. A new individualism emerged. That is, people felt themselves to be embedded in communities before. Their primary loyalty was the community, the family, the tribe, the village. And in modernity, people became independent, each one for himself, each one for herself. A new individualism emerged. And secondly, what emerged was a utilitarian spirit. In the past, people were committed to a set of values which came to them from their religion, and they believed that these values were really part of the cosmos. This was the way God had created the world, and therefore they tried to be faithful to them. They acknowledged them, and even when they broke them, they felt nonetheless we believe in them and we want to go back to them. And what happened with modernity is that people were concerned with the useful, with how to get on and how to move forward, and therefore it was the useful, the utilitarian, that replaced the permanent, abiding values. And thirdly, with modernity came secularization. That is, in traditional society, you took for granted the religion into which you were born. I mean, this was true especially in Europe, where after the 30 Years' War in 1648, the Peace of Westphalia tried to settle the conflict between Catholics and Protestants in Europe, and this was done by the principle that the religion of the prince determined the religion of the subjects, and therefore if the prince was Catholic, the people had to either become Catholics, and if they were not, they had to leave. If the prince was Protestant, then the people had to be Protestant, and if they didn't want to be, they had to leave. So you had in Europe, a religion was patterned according to geography, and therefore you were born into a religion and you regarded this as the kind of sacred cosmos in which you lived. And with modernity, you had the introduction, you had shifting populations, you had people moving to factories, you had the coming apart of traditional patterns, you had pluralism, religious pluralism, and this was eventually accompanied by a great deal of secularization, and therefore the opposition of the church to this was not simply the kind of political ideology because the papacy was attached to the old order. The opposition of the church really represented the attitudes of the vast majority of ordinary people living in traditional society, being overawed by this modernity that come in upon them. Now, why do I find this so interesting? I find this so interesting because today this modernity is moving into the rest of the world, and therefore you have very similar experiences today by people in Africa and Asia who come in conflict with modernity, that is, who discover modernity, democracy and industrialization, and who react to it very much as Catholics reacted to it in the 19th century. And it is well known that in many Muslim countries in particular, who came to know modernity through colonization, that there was and there is very often a great resistance to these new patterns of life, which undermine traditional society, make it disappear, and introduce people into a totally new self-understanding. And this is really what I learned from the sociologist, and it wasn't, that is, the liberals in the 19th century thought that this modernity would be a kind of road towards ever-growing progress. That is, they thought that greater democracy and greater technology and greater industry would lead us further and further into progress. The sociologists were much more cautious because they realized while on the one hand modernity creates great advantages, it rests ambiguous and it has all kinds of problematic dimensions which they examined. So I learned this when I studied sociology, and I wrote about this. And in recent years, when I've become interested in Islam, I found this enormously useful because it's helped me to understand the reaction of people coming from traditional societies to the encounter with modernity. I want to mention an interesting Catholic figure, Jacques Maritain, famous Catholic philosopher, and his career, I think, gives you a picture of what we went through in the Catholic Church. That is the spiritual conversion of Maritain in accepting modernity and accepting modernity in terms of his Christian faith. When in 1906 he and his wife became Catholics, he joined an extremely conservative movement in France called l'Action Française under the leadership of Charles Maurras. This was a movement that was opposed to the Republic, opposed to modernity, opposed to parliamentary democracy, and it was a movement that wanted to restore the monarchy in France. Maritain joined this, and he wrote a book in 1921 called Anti-Moderne, that is against modernity, against this new spirit. He was totally dedicated against it. In 1927, Pope Pius XI condemned Action Française. This was an enormous shock for many Catholics in France. For Maritain, a terrible shock. He writes about this. In 1928, he publishes a book called Primauté du Spirituel, in which he examines the shock, and he says, why did the Pope do this? And he argues in this book that the Pope condemned Action Française because Maurras, the leader, was in fact an atheist, and the Pope did not want a Catholic movement to be chaired by an atheist. And he consoles his French readers and says, even though Action Française is moderne, we still have all the condemnations of modernity by the papacy. We still have the Syllabus of Errors of 1864, and we still have the other documents that repudiate human rights and democracy and separation of church and state. He was still believed this is the way the Catholic Church must react to modernity. But he gradually changed his mind. And that is in 1933, he published a book called Du régime temporel et de la liberté, in 1933, in which he moves ahead and he offers new reflections. I mean, it's very interesting. A man deeply committed to an anti-modernist viewpoint changes his mind. And in this book he explores, in the line of Greek and Christian philosophy, the nature of the human person, and he argues that human beings are intelligent, they have a moral consciousness, they have freedom, and therefore they are altogether unique beings within the cosmos, and therefore they have a dignity which must be respected. And therefore he offers an argument for human rights. That is, the dignity of human beings as such, that this must be respected by all governing authorities. And therefore he laid a kind of philosophical foundation for human rights. And in the same book, he begins to change his mind, and he says, the church has lived in many different ages and contexts, and in the past the church lived in a kind of sacred regime, that is, in a society that was really determined by the sacred inheritance, by the Catholic inheritance. Today, the church lives in a profane society, that is, in a society that is defined no longer in terms of the sacred, in terms of religion, but simply in terms of secular values. And therefore he says, what was right for the church in the sacred context is not right in the secular context, and therefore the Catholic Church is capable of changing its teaching and accepting human rights and accepting democracy. This is possible. He wrote this in 1933. In 1936, he wrote his major work, a famous work called L'Intégrisme intégral, translated into English, a very important book in Catholic education. It was his humanism, the integral humanism, in which he, as a Catholic, was in dialogue with modernity. And I see somebody's bringing me gin. Thank you. Thank you. And he wrote this book in which he had an open critical dialogue with modernity, and he reconciled his Christian faith with this new world in the making. He remained a critic of modernity. He remained a critic of the economic system. He remained, if you like, he became a man of the left. During the Spanish Civil War, he supported the Republicans against Franco. He engaged himself in a number of organizations. During the war, he spent his years in New York, in the United States, and he wrote a book in 1944. I have it written down here, the title, yes. Christianity and Democracy, published in 1943 during the war. And in it, he argues that the liberal ideas of democratic pluralism and human rights are secularized values derived from the teaching of Jesus. So you have really an extraordinary career of a person who began as an arch-reactionary, standing against these modern values, moving gradually, and becoming one of the great teachers in the Catholic Church, with influence. Pope John the 23rd and Pope Paul were strongly influenced by Maritain, and the change in the official teaching of the Church regarding modernity took place in part under the influence of this thinker and other such thinkers. I mean, it is very interesting to me, this career. Just recently, a couple, Max and Monique Memni, I know them both, they were professors in Quebec, wrote a book, began to write a book, or they published the first volume of a book on Trudeau. It's called an intellectual biography. And this book, I mean, when they wrote the book, they were absolutely scandalized because they had access to Trudeau's papers, and they found documents. I mean, Trudeau was a person who wrote down the name of every book he read, and he recorded his reactions to the book. And throughout all these young years, and they found this, and they were absolutely, totally unprepared to find that Trudeau was an arch-reactionary in the late 30s and 40s in Quebec. He was an arch-reactionary, totally opposed to modernity, totally opposed to democracy, to capitalism, to democracy, and these people who wrote the book don't really know very much about Catholic history, and therefore they were absolutely amazed and puzzled by this, and thought this was all the faults of the Jesuit, of Birth College, they always talk about these Jesuits. They don't know that in the 19th century, this was the Catholic reaction to modernity. That they quote Maritain and say, this great philosopher Maritain defends human rights. Yes, but they don't know that Maritain, as a young man, was still very much opposed to this. And so it is interesting that Trudeau came from this background. In Quebec, this opposition to modernity lasted much longer. It's only in the second volume, which isn't published yet, that he will change his mind about these things. So I think it's very instructive for us to look at these issues, because today you have Muslims who find themselves in a very similar situation. How to deal with modernity, what can we do? Must we simply reject it, or is it possible for us to reread our tradition and to be open to it? I mean, I use the word rereading the tradition. I mean, this is how religions move forward in history. Not by arbitrarily changing their viewpoints, not by importing new ideas from the outside, not by being unfaithful to their tradition, but by rereading their texts. And you reread texts, and when you reread certain texts in new situations, you hear what the ancients did not hear. That is, the same text can have quite different meanings in different ages. Now, we all know this in regard to secular literature. Shakespeare is read in every generation, and if you ever look at commentaries on Shakespeare, you will find that each generation hears in the plays quite different messages, because we listen to the plays, we bring to the plays the problem which we have in our own generation, in our own society, and as we bring the problems of our own society to these plays, the plays talk to us, and we hear what our ancestors didn't hear. And the same thing, of course, is true of the sacred scriptures. And so it is the reading and the rereading. And it's interesting, let me just give an example of this. John the 23rd, in his encyclical Pacem Terris, published in 1963, I think it was, 63. In it, he was greatly impressed by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and he defended human rights in this encyclical, and he finds justification for this in the scriptures. And he reads the book, the story of creation, that human beings are created in the image of God, and reflects on this, and he says, if this is true, if humans are created in the image of God, this is such a high dignity, this is such a privilege, that surely this is altogether special, and this must be respected. And secondly, he rereads the New Testament, and he argues with the coming of Jesus, something has changed for the entire humanity. That is, the Holy Spirit addresses every human being. Wherever human beings are, they are addressed by the Spirit. And therefore, again, this extraordinary dignity of human beings, and for this reason, their rights must be respected. That is, their dignity demands respect. And so by rereading the traditions, he comes to this new insight. And this principle of rereading the tradition is, again, also used in other religions, and it is used in Muslims. Now, I mean, the encounter of Muslims with the modernity took place in a quite different way. It took place through colonization. After all, the colonization of the Muslim world began in the 19th century quite early. Napoleon already went to Egypt, but It began very seriously with, in the 1830s with Algeria, and then of course Morocco and Tunisia and Libya and Egypt, far away India, British colony, and even after the First World War, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, it was Syria and Iraq and Palestine and Lebanon that became mandates of Britain and of France. And so, therefore, they encountered modernity through colonization, that is, through being oppressed by colonizers. And this provoked a number of movements among Muslims, and one of them was a reform movement. That is, there were thinkers who said, why is it that we Muslims have let ourselves be conquered by these Europeans? And many of them said it is that our religion has fallen asleep. Our religion has fallen asleep. That is, it has not made us vigorous. It has made us passive. We want to repossess our religion. And you're at the beginning of a reform movement. These names are well known to me now because I am interested in this, and so I read about them. It began with a man called Al-Afghani who died in 1897, and there was a series of such Muslim intellectuals who said, we want to reread our history. We want to reread the beginnings of our history, not in order to imitate what the ancients did, but in order to be inspired by them to see how to react to the present situation. And one of the elements that appeared very clearly is that they argued that the revelation, the divine revelation, the Quran, is not simply a message for Muslims, but it is a message for the world. And they argued that revealed in the Quran is that all human beings are created by God. All human beings are created by God. All human beings have been gifted with intelligence. That is, intelligence is the important gift, and therefore study and science is terribly important because we are gifted with intelligence. And they argued that that the ancients said that God created humans being by his breath, spiritus, we say spiritus is breath, and that this breath of God remains with humans, and because the breath remains with humans, they are able to long for God and turn to God and pray to God. And this is not simply true of Muslims, but this is the human condition. This is how they describe the human condition. Now, the interesting, what has interested me when I read these authors is that they go back to the early years of the Muslim movement, in which the Muslims encountered Greek philosophy. That is, the early Christians encountered Platonism and the ancient Greek philosophers, and this became part of us. This rationality, Greek rationality, became part of Christianity. And what is not so well known is that this is also true of Muslims. They too encountered the same philosophical traditions, were influenced by it. And this leads me inevitably to the speech that Pope Benedict XVI gave a few days ago at the University of Regensburg, in which he revealed his ignorance of the Muslim tradition. In this lecture, he is interested, and it's a brilliant lecture. It's a brilliant lecture, and Benedict XVI writes a seductively beautiful German. It is just a marvelous, I mean, it's a pleasure to read, even when you don't agree with him, it's a pleasure to read him. And in this lecture, he deals with faith and reason. And why with faith and reason? Because at German universities, theology is taught, that is, from the 19th century on especially, German universities teach Catholic and Protestant theology. And of course there are some people now who say, we've become more secular, why should theology be taught at the university? Shouldn't the theology be taught at seminaries, where you have believing Christians? But this is we at the university, we are interested in reason and science, and therefore perhaps there is no place for theology. And the Pope wanted to reply to this, and that is why he spoke about faith and reason. And he argues, as he always does, and perfectly correctly, that reason in antiquity meant not only scientific rationality, that is the kind of rationality that is used in the sciences, where you empirically demonstrate theses, but reason in the ancient world also meant the entry into metaphysics, that you have a sense of what is human nature, and what is the good, and what is the purpose of life. This was part of rationality in antiquity, coming from the Greeks in particular. And he argues, therefore, that Christianity was very much impressed by Greek culture. And when the Greeks talked about this order of the universe and the rationality in the universe and the intelligence of the human mind and the ability of humans to discover that throughout the cosmos there is a single cause, and therefore we must affirm there is an author of all of this. This is in keeping with the scriptures, and he spoke about this beautifully. And he said that today in the West rationality has restricted itself, it has limited itself, and limited itself simply to scientific rationality, to empirical demonstration, and the metaphysical side has been totally repressed. And in this context, then, he came to speak about Islam. Now, I should say that Pope John Paul II had enormous respect for Islam. There are many passages in which he praises their faith and their worship, and there are passages where he insists that we worship the same God. Again and again he said this, we Catholics and Muslims, we worship the same God. And therefore John Paul II said that in the future we should not be communities in conflict, but we should become communities in cooperation. And this was quite radical and revolutionary, because this was the first time that Christians and even the Pope used this kind of language. But Pope Benedict XVI, I mean, I've read his publications when he was still Cardinal Ratzinger, had hesitations in this regard. That is, he didn't really think that we worship the same God. That is, he thought that there was such a difference in interpretation that you couldn't really say it was the same God. And so in his speech in Regensburg, he returns to this question. And he quotes a 14th century Christian emperor prior to the conquest of Constantinople, who is speaking to a Persian intellectual, a Muslim, and this emperor says to this Muslim, if you look, let's see if I can find the exact quotation, maybe I can't. Yes, show me just what Mohammed brought that was new, and there you will find only things evil and inhuman. such as his command to spread with the sword the faith he preached. Now, there's nothing wrong in quoting such a sentence, but you would expect in the present national, international situation, you would immediately add, this is not what the church holds today. I mean, imagine a Presbyterian minister giving a speech in which he said that in the confessions of the Presbyterian Church in the 16th century, the Pope is regarded as the Antichrist. Now, you would expect the minister to say, oh, yes, I mean, we did this in the 16th century, but we Presbyterians don't hold this today. Now, the Pope missed this opportunity. And there was an outrage, and the outrage took really quite irrational and violent form. But much more interesting is how Benedict continues. Benedict says, Benedict mentions that the emperor continues the argument, saying that spreading the faith through violence is something unreasonable, and in fact that violence is incompatible with the nature of God. That is, the emperor said this. Violence is incompatible with the nature of God. And then Benedict continues, relying on a contemporary scholar, Benedict says, for the emperor, as a Byzantine shaped by Greek philosophy, this statement is self-evident. That is, that God acts always within reason. That is, our intelligence is reflecting God's wisdom, and therefore when God acts, it will be good. When God acts, it is in keeping with reason. And Benedict even says that this is the... yes, I have the quotation here. Then he says, but for Muslim rationality. So he wants to establish here a difference with our understanding of God. That is, God is always in keeping with rationality, while the view of the Muslims is really different, that God is beyond rationality, and therefore God can contradict himself. But is this really true? Let us follow Benedict's reasoning. It is a conviction that acting unreasonably contradicts God's nature. He asks, is this conviction that acting unreasonably contradicts God's nature merely a Greek idea? Does it simply come from Plato and Aristotle? Or is it always and intrinsically true? And then he says, I believe that here we can see the profound harmony between what is Greek in the best sense of the word and the biblical understanding of the faith in God. I mean, this is very much the Catholic tradition, that we accepted the Bible, but we accepted the Bible in a Hellenistic context, and therefore the Hellenistic tradition, the philosophical tradition, is part of us, and therefore we see the harmony between the two. This belief is held by the great theologians of antiquity and the Middle Ages, including St. Augustine and St. Thomas. But then later on, Benedict admits that the medieval thinker Duns Scotus introduced a voluntarism into Catholic theology that eventually produced the idea of God's total freedom, not limited by reason. In other words, God could have done the very opposite of what God actually did. So Benedict admits that in Catholicism there is a debate about this. There is the major tradition, but there is an alternative tradition. He mentioned Duns Scotus and subsequent authors who say God is so mysterious and so much transcendent that God is not limited by rationality, and therefore there could be contradictions in God. I mean, there are some authors who say God is beyond good and evil. This would be such a thing. So, what Benedict did not know is that the same ambiguity, the same debate about the relation of reason and revelation exists in the Muslim tradition. That is, he shows it exists in the Catholic tradition, but exactly the same debate exists in the Muslim tradition. The early Muslim thinkers read the works of Greek philosophy in translation and produced the Mutazila school of thought that recognized the harmony between reason and revelation. While some of these thinkers became rationalists and were rejected by the mainstream, Mutazilite influence never disappeared, and the reform movement of which I spoke at the beginning in Islam, beginning with Al-Afghani, acknowledged human intelligence as a divine gift and honored the rationality implicit in divine revelation. So we have here we have a regrettable incident where the Benedict XVI, this lack of sympathy, yes, one should add that when Benedict XVI became Pope, he made an organizational change. You had in Rome the Pontifical Council of Interreligious Dialogue, and this was chaired by Archbishop Fitzgerald, who was a great specialist on Islam. He was a famous scholar. He was dismissed by Benedict XVI. He was made a nuncio in Egypt, and the work of this Pontifical Council of Interreligious Dialogue was put into the hands of another congregation, the Pontifical Council for Culture. And this was obviously a gesture of calming down, or at least of limiting a little bit this enormous intimacy that John Paul II has created between Catholics and Muslims. And therefore throughout the Catholic press this was recorded and this was reported, and therefore this was an occasion in which this lack of sympathy on the part of the present Pope revealed itself. Because of this enormous outburst, a few days later, Benedict XVI invited the ambassadors of all the Muslim countries to come to an audience. He invited the representatives of the Muslims in Italy, and he gave an extraordinary speech, which you can, if you have the internet, you can find this very easily. Vatican. You go to Benedict XVI, you go under speeches, and then you'll find quite easily the speech, a marvelous speech in which he goes back to the great text of the Second Vatican Council, the great text of John the 23rd, in which he respects Islam and in which he promises dialogue and cooperation, and recognizes the ambiguity of all religious traditions. I would just mention, just a few days ago, major Islamic scholars have published an open letter to the Pope, which is a beautiful document of 4 pages, which is written in a very reconciling tone, in which they clarify certain things which the Pope says about the Islamic tradition, very scholarly, but no angry tone at all. On the contrary, they say that the world is so deeply divided, so many crimes and violent crimes are committed everywhere, that Catholics and Muslims together constitute a major section of humanity, and unless we can work together and be friends together, we can't really expect the world to overcome its divisions, and therefore this is an extraordinary document. This was published, signed by 24 leading Muslim scholars and leaders, addressed to the Pope. It's a document that is especially interesting. Now, let me return to Maritain, this extraordinary man who grew up who was committed to an anti-modernist view and eventually reread the history and reinterpreted the history of Catholicism and opened himself to modern ideas. That such Maritains exist also in Muslim authors. That is, there are great Muslim authors, great philosophers, who very much like Maritain reread the history and reread the history and find new interpretations. I think this is an enormously important point because we have before us in the United States the so-called theory of the clash of civilizations. That this expression goes back to a book published by Samuel Huntington in about 1996, in which he argues that the great civilizations of the world are all grounded in a religion, and because the religion, he says, have incompatible values, therefore it is almost inevitable that the civilizations will clash and that you will have conflicts. And in fact, he warns Americans of the special danger of the Islamic danger, the clash of civilizations, and of course of the Chinese, who are beginning to produce so much that the market it will be destabilized in the USA. Now, this theory of the clash of civilization, of course, is really quite wrong, because it presupposes that religions have sort of clearly defined values which never change, and religions have sacred texts which they read, to which they want to be faithful, and they reread these sacred texts in different situations, and in different situations they hear from these different texts. They are addressed by their sacred texts in a new way, and therefore it is quite untrue to say that religions have incompatible values. I'll give you one famous example. In the 40s and 50s, there were in the USA authors, I'm just trying to think of the name of the man, it escapes me at the moment, I should have written it down, who argued that Catholics can't become good Americans. Why not? Because he said that Catholics have rejected religious liberty. This was true. That is, the official teaching of the Catholic Church was conservative until the Vatican Council, and therefore the official teaching of the Church rejected religious liberty. The official teaching was that if the country is Catholic, then the state must protect the true religion. But if the country is Protestant, then Catholics are majorities, and then if they are minorities, they can defend religious liberty because they serve the true faith. And this was very opportunistic, but this was the official position. And therefore these authors said, be afraid of Catholics, because Catholics cannot become good Democrats. If they become the majority in the USA, then they would declare all the Protestant churches illegal, and therefore we have to mistrust them. And therefore these authors thought there was the clash of civilization. They had the idea that religions are kind of fixed entities, do you remember the name of this author? I met him personally. In fact, he came to Rome during the Vatican Council, and he was totally confused. I met him there. At my age, that happens to me. This goes. It is a good example. That is, he thought there was a clash of civilization. That is, religions had defined their values, but he didn't realize that religions are faithful to sacred texts, to sacred scriptures, and rereading these sacred scriptures can lead to very different results. I mean, just another example. The scriptures are full of texts in which the unwillingness of the Jews to believe in Jesus is expressed in very negative terms. And out of these very negative terms has been created an entire anti-Jewish rhetoric within the Christian tradition for over the centuries. And yet, rereading the scriptures, as was done at the Second Vatican Council, we focused on passages which are quite different, on passages which honor the place that Jews have held, that the Jewish tradition have held in the Christian tradition, and in particular passages of the Apostle Paul, who tells us in the Epistle to the Romans that even though the Jews did not believe in Jesus, they have not been rejected. They remain God's first loved people. Why? Because God's promises are irrevocable. So, rereading your text, rereading the scriptures, the church responds in new ways to historical situation, and this is also true of other religions. This is certainly true of all religions, and this is true of Muslims. I think I was invited to this center, I think last year or 2 years ago, I forget now, last year, in which I had occasion to speak about two particular authors who have impressed me. I won't go into this now. A Turkish author by the name of Gülen, Fethullah Gülen, who is a mystic, who is an intellectual, who is an organizer, a great Muslim leader, and who interprets the Quran, finds support in the Quran for religious pluralism, for democracy, for human rights. He visited the Pope, he visited the chief rabbi of Jerusalem, he visited the Orthodox Archbishop of Constantinople. He has an enormous following. He has created schools. He has a major following. I became familiar with them because they are Turkish immigrants, recent immigrants in Montreal. Some of them are educated people, engineers in business. Some of them are graduate students getting their degrees at universities. And they're inspired by this man, and they've created a society called Dialogue Foundation, and they raise money every year to invite about 250 citizens of Montreal from different religions and different organizations, pluralistically, to have supper together in order to celebrate the kind of plural world which God has created. And they are Muslims, and they say Muslim prayers, but they also ask other people to pray and to speak. So I met them, I was invited by them, and I went to their founder, and I found the books by this founder and about this founder. He is one such person, and when I spoke here the last time, I also spoke about Tariq Ramadan, who is born in Egypt. He is, born in Switzerland, but of Egyptian parents, who is a major scholar, I mean really comparable to Maritain, a major scholar with major books, in which he is faithful to the past and yet open to the future. And I'm working on this. I hope that I have a chance to write about this in greater detail, because the dominant view in the world is that Muslims are, that somehow there is violence indigenous to the Muslim tradition, or that their faith is really not intelligent. There are many prejudices, and I think that we as Catholics are we have a sensitivity for understanding them, because we have moved in such a dramatic way ourselves out of opposition to modernity, out of opposition to democracy and human rights. We've moved out of this, and therefore we can really understand them and understand their struggle, and this inspires me. Thank you. What?
Can you take some questions?
Sure.
Gregory, am I on? No, I'm not on. Unmute. Testing. Now I'm on. We get a little feedback when we have that one back on. Gregory will take some questions right now. We have microphones on either side of the hall here. So if you could come forward and ask a question, that would be great. We're not sure how long Gregory's voice will hold out, so we'll take a couple questions before we get to the book signing. So I welcome you to come forward to one of the microphones.
Hi, Gregory. Is this on? No? Yes? Okay. I'm fascinated by your talking about modernity and the parallels between the modernity in Western civilization and now in Muslim countries. I wonder if you could speak to the rise of modern science in the Muslim world versus the Christian world, because the rise of modern science was very instrumental in issuing in modernity. But there are lots of scholars who have wondered about the fact that even though in the Middle Ages you had science, very sophisticated science, in the Muslim world, but it didn't develop into what we call empirical science, that then had such an important influence in industrial capitalism and democracy. So I'm wondering historically about that, but also in terms of contemporary things, the role of science in those two things. Yeah.
Yes, this would deserve a much more careful analysis than I'm able to give. It is quite true that there were scientific insights in antiquity. There were the sciences of the Muslim civilization earlier, before the West really woke up to it, the science in the Middle Ages. But what happened in modernity was so different, at least according to Max Weber, that science was used to create technology for production. And this was really the new thing. When you study physics in high school, sometimes you see a kind of a heron sphere that is in antiquity, Greek antiquity, there was a kind of they knew that you could transform heat into kinetic energy. You have a sphere of glass, you have two arms sticking out, and at the end they are bent in opposite directions and they are open. You put a bit of water into this sphere, you put a candle underneath to light the fire, it will boil, the steam will come out of these arms in different directions, and you will have the turning, this sphere with the arms is on two forks, and you will have the turning of the sphere. In other words, the Greeks knew it was possible to transform heat into kinetic energy, but it didn't occur to them to use this for production. And so I think that the modern spirit, certainly science, yes, research science, but this was almost immediately used for production, for wars and for production. And therefore this created a totally different attitude to the sciences, and therefore we have developed these sciences into which as no one else did. It was Max Weber who, at the turn of the 19th century, asked this question and did his work on this. And today, the reformers, these Muslim reformers at the end of the 19th century, whom I mentioned, are very much scientifically oriented. Gulen, whom I mentioned, is very scientifically oriented and said it was we were stuck in an old world where we didn't realize the importance of the sciences, and now we want to learn from this. Of course, the sciences have their own ambiguity. I just read a book by a man, again, whose name escapes me, a great scientist, who describes how absolutely horrified he was after the dropping of the atomic bomb, when he thought that this atomic research and investigating the hidden parts of these tiniest particles, how this was used. And so he asked the question, is really, which way are we going? The sciences are not as objective as they appear, but they are financed. Experiments are very expensive. So who makes decision in what direction science goes? And if you study this, is this industry, is this government, is this defense, is this weaponry? And so when you see the monies and the orientation that goes into research and the orientation, you get a sense of the ambiguity of science. And so to be reminded, and here we have to praise Benedict XVI, who constantly laments about the relativism, that is the absence of ethical reflection, that so much of our modern developments are really without total absence of ethical reflection, and therefore without this, the sciences without this remain problematic.
I've read something about Islam, not very much admittedly, but it seems that a devout Muslim believes that the Quran is the literal word of God. At the same time, the Quran contains quite a few invocations to violence, and therefore it would seem that a devout Muslim believes that God entreats him or her to take violent action against people like infidels, against members of the faith who leave the faith, and so on. To the rest of the world, this is a fundamental problem, and I'm wondering just how you see it.
Yeah, you can say the same thing about the Bible. The Bible has these terrible passages where in the Old Testament where God really decides on genocide. You remember, you've read when the people of Israel move into Palestine, the Promised Land, they have to exterminate the tribes who lived there. And you have these terrible passages where God decrees this, and where even some Israelites sometimes had mercy and didn't kill all the children, and they were then punished by God because they didn't really destroy these tribes. When you read the early parts of the Old Testament, God is very much the God of legions, Sabaoth, God of legions. That is, it was a kind of war. It was a kind of a war God. It was really only in the prophetic books, in the later books of the prophets, where you had an enormous purification of the idea of God. You had, in the Bible, you have this enormous sort of Israel is being taught. God teaches Israel about divinity, and so in the prophets, then you have the very different image of God emerging. So you do have dark passages. So I think there are dark passages in the Bible. there are dark passages in the New Testament. I mean, I mentioned briefly the anti-Jewish texts. I mean that in the fourth gospel, for instance, we are told that Jesus said to the Jews, your father was the devil. And these texts were carried on in the history of the Christian church with terrible, violent consequences. So I think that sacred scriptures have dark texts, and that the theologians have always said that the dark texts have to be overruled by the lightful texts. That is, there are priorities, and this is the love of God and love of neighbor has priorities, and therefore we read these dark texts in the scriptures, and we argue that they have to be trumped by the more important and essential messages that God is love, and that we are called upon to love God and love our neighbor. In other words, in the ancients said that we read the Bible always in the Spirit. It is a literalistic reading of the Bible can lead us very much astray. But reading it in the Spirit, which meant for these ancients that in the spirit of the church, that in the spirit of the believing community, enabled us to pay attention, especially to these life-giving passages, and to interpret these other passages in different ways. I remember, it occurs to me that one ancient Christian author was very unhappy about, the story of the Exodus, when the people of Israel are rescued by God and they leave the Egyptians, and afterwards you have the Egyptian army pursues them, and they all drown in the Red Sea. And he was terribly bothered by this because, these soldiers, they were not Pharaoh, they were not responsible, they didn't make these decisions, they were just sent there after them. And so he said, well, the meaning of these texts is really, this announces the future of baptism. And that is this, he felt the need to give a kind of spiritual interpretation of this. I mentioned this text to show that Christians from the very beginning were nervous about some of these biblical texts, and they said, what can we do with them? We know this is not in keeping with our tradition, and so they try to give... and so I think that Muslims are very much in the same way, that is, you are these passages from a dark passage, the difficult passages, you want to try to find out exactly what were the historical conditions in which were said, but good Muslim theologians would think they have to be, priority have to be given to the more essential commandments.
It's good to hear a speech by an optimist. I enjoyed the lecture, and particularly when you raised the question about the Catholics out of their experience in dealing with modernity, throughout the experience of particularly in a way that you deal with it because you seem to be able to get out from the tradition in which the Catholic thinking were traditionally taught at university settings, and in which rationality is the key to studying theology, not just science. And then you mentioned about your optimism by saying that out of that, the Muslims would probably go the same route, that they would also learn to deal with modernism, modernity, by rereading the scripture. And I wish I could share with you your optimism on that. The reason for my skepticism is really, I'm not so worried about the Catholics, because even in their seminaries, they are attached to university settings. And by nature of university setting, as you mentioned, rationality is the key to studying theology. You can argue and debate and get all the ideas from different angles and perspectives. However, in North America, at least in European tradition, theologies are basically taught in universities. But in North American settings, I don't see that theologies are taught at university settings. And you have all sorts of theological seminaries, Bible colleges, and where the theologies are taught in a very narrow focus, very minded fashion, a denominational fashion. And you have generations of so-called theologians coming out from those settings. They do not have the way of looking at theology in a rational fashion, and therefore they are not able to see the other perspective or looking at other religions. Muslim is just one of them. So my skepticism is, in North America here, at least your optimism, I wish I could share.
Well, I think it's a good reminder that, there are indeed Christian, Muslim, and Jewish schools that could be small and quite narrow. I quite agree with this. But big universities have their faults too. Good heavens. There is, if you go to economics department and political science department, very often big universities are so conformist. Research money is available really for people who play along. And therefore you go to small colleges and you find in the political science and economics departments much more critical thinkers than you have at big universities. So I think that all institutions have their strengths and their weakness, and so I wouldn't, I'm in touch with Muslims in Montreal, educated people, reading people, university people. I have great affinity to the way in which they think and which they work. They want to be faithful to their sacred text. I am faithful. I want to be faithful to the sacred text of my church. But conversation is really quite possible, and we learn from one another. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gregory. I've invited Dr. David Seljak, former director of the Center for Catholic Experience, also an associate professor here in religious studies at St. Jerome's University and the chair of the University of Waterloo Religious Studies Department, to come up and say an official thank you for Gregory. David is the other St. Jerome's professor who wrote the foreword of Religion and Alienation.
Somehow I have an overwhelming urge to insult Michael Higgins. And I find I can't, of course. He's gone on to St. Thomas University. Now Megan at least shares the challenge of peering over this podium that Michael had, and so at least I can direct a few comments towards her. Megan was actually... Dr. Seljak. David, please. Megan was one of my first students here at St. Jerome's University, and she's gone on to earn her doctorate at the Leeds University in the UK, and now teaches at King's College. runs the St. Jerome Center, and so it's a privilege to be up here, introduced by her. I had my first class with Dr. Gregory Baum in 1978, and I'll embarrass him by saying he was 55 years old at the time. And I remember one of the first lectures he gave on papal infallibility, and it really caught me. I remember talking to my Catholic friends afterwards and saying, you know, all that BS we learned about the Pope, none of it's true, right? The papal infallibility doesn't extend back to Adam and Eve, that it was something created, or at least officially recognized in the Church only in 1870, and that it only applies to certain teachings and not to all. Not every word that comes out of the Pope's mouth is infallible. The second class I had with Gregory Baum was formed around this book, Religion and Alienation. And I have to say, I was a terrible student. At the time, I was working for a university campus newspaper, and Gregory's was a Tuesday night class, and there was a production night at the newspaper on Tuesday nights, and I became very interested in newspapering. I also became very interested in a young woman who happened to work at that newspaper, and so I have to confess that I didn't make it to many lectures, but I always remember Gregory's words when I handed in my final paper. He looked at me and he said, "Are you sure that you are in my course?" It's a deeply touching experience. I caught up with Gregory again at McGill University in 1987, and was his doctoral student, as was Scott Klein, and so it was both as doctoral students and students of Gregory Baum and also as professors that we pestered him and Novalis to publish a second edition of Religion and Alienation, but we're so glad that he had taken up that challenge. I want to thank Gregory on behalf of the group for an insightful talk, but I also want to take this occasion to thank Gregory for the many things that I have received from him. One of them is the inability to lecture without gesturing. And always, as everyone who's been a student of Gregory's, first they gesture on this side, and then to show that they're making a balanced argument, the next gesture goes on this side. But more importantly, I learned about the social dimension of human life, that a lot of our personal problems, in fact, are social issues, and that we cannot understand ourselves unless we understand the society in which we live and how that society moves through history. I also learned, as Scott Klein emphasized in his introductory remarks, the importance of the recognition of the other. Especially, I always reminded, and I use this in my classes so frequently, that important passage, the parable of the sheep and the goats. And, you know, I was hungry, you gave me to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. I was in prison, you came to visit me. I was alienated, and you analyzed me. No, I was the alien, and you welcomed me. And how important that passage has become to our understanding of the hidden tradition, or the best-kept secret in the Roman Catholic Church, its social teachings. And so with Gregory, it's not only the recognition of the other, but it's the solidarity with the other that he has expressed in so many of his writings on the preferential option for the poor. And the poor is not just the person without money, it is always the person who is marginalized by whatever debate or whatever dominant discourse is occurring at the time. It is women in a sexist society, people of color in a racist society, Muslims in a time of a global and unending war on terror. The third thing I learned from Gregory is never turn your back on evil. I teach a course, RS 100L, called simply Evil. And Gregory is really the inspiration for that course. I came to St. Jerome's. The course was called Peace, Justice, and Development. I started teaching Religion and Alienation in it. But with a course called Peace, Justice, and Development, you get 10 students. They all wear Birkenstocks and natural fibers. And they're wonderful students, but I wanted to talk to a broader audience. And really, this is, I think, if I wanted to sum up Gregory's career, I would say that there is this constant fascination, or I shouldn't say fascination, obsession, or dedication to never refusing to turn your back on evil, to always look for the victim. And Gregory has dedicated his scholarly life to that. I also learned the importance of dialogue, and Gregory talked about that tonight, especially dialogue with the other, and the fact that dialogue with the other always begins with self-criticism. We look at ourselves before we criticize the other, something perhaps Benedict XVI might have considered before giving his fateful speech. I also learned to remain faithful to the past while open to the future. That we need, as the saying goes, both roots and wings. I remember Gregory talking to students who thought they wanted to leave one tradition for another, and he'd say, grow where you are planted. Not his own line, but always the message from Gregory is that one's own tradition has deep roots, is a great source of wealth. There are always the seeds of redemption in every tradition. There are seeds of redemption in Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, in Catholicism, in Protestantism, in each and every tradition. Another lesson was never stop learning. Gregory began his career writing a book on Jewish-Christian relations and became internationally and nationally known, in fact featured on the cover of Time Magazine Canada, or Maclean's Magazine, or Time Magazine, wasn't it, in Canada, for his work in ecumenism in the 1960s. And then in the late 60s, he turned to psychoanalysis and wrote in 1970 a book, Man Becoming. And then to sociology, where he Religion and Alienation. And then to, later on, to liberation theology and critical theology. And then moved on to understand the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. He studied the Hungarian economist Karl Polanyi. And then he moved to Quebec to understand that part of the Canadian reality, and then to understand now his new interest in Islam. I hope that by the time I'm 80, I have this kind of intellectual curiosity and energy myself. But finally, Gregory, I learned to do all of this in love. Gregory always taught that one can look at any church doctrine, any theological teaching, always in terms of its historical consequence. That if a teaching leads to violence, then it cannot be a true teaching. It cannot be true, it cannot be from God. And it had to be reconsidered. And so that, as he said, Scripture has to be read in the Spirit. The magisterium of the church has to be read in the Spirit. And the Spirit is love. And for all of these lessons, both in life and in academia, Gregory, I would like to thank you on behalf of myself, of course, but also on behalf of your other students here tonight and across Canada and throughout the world. Thank you.